Hey everyone, and welcome to the Crossway podcast. My name is Josh, and today I'm in the studio with our experienced pastor, Kelly Lafferty.
Hey, Josh.
Kelly actually gave us the message this past Sunday. Was this technically a part of our Family 35 series? I sort of labeled it that way online.
I think that's fine.
So yes, it was, because that's what
absolutely.
I did. But anyway, she gave us the message on Sunday and sort of walked us through the story of the woman at the well, and gave us some great points to think about. Kelly, why don't you just real quick recap sort of the main thrust of the points you made on Sunday, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you wanted to add.
Yep, sure. So on Sunday, I went over John chapter 4. So if you haven't read the story of the woman at the well, it's just a really good reminder that Jesus kind of meets us in the places where we sometimes least expect him. So if you haven't read the story, really go read it, kind of dig into it. But the main points that I wanted to make about this story and the conversation that Jesus had with the Samaritan woman was that each step of our journey has purpose. So a lot of times we can't see or we don't understand exactly what's happening, but we just need to look for Jesus in those moments, the moments where things are bad or we don't understand exactly where he's leading us. We just need to look up and look for Jesus and have that conversation with him to help guide us to the next place. And the other point that I made was that even crappy places can be redeemed. So a lot of times the things that we experience, we have embarrassing things that happen to our lives and we want to tuck them away and we don't want to deal with them. And we don't think Jesus belongs there either. But what Jesus kind of teaches us in this story, that he actually wants to go to those places with us and for us, and that he's willing to kind of step into to our mess, into the brokenness that we experience, and kind of help us redeem those situations by showing us our sin and the things that is holding us back and keeping us from really being in a relationship with him. And so those were really the 2 points that I wanted to make on Sunday. As I was preparing this message, I had one more point, and so that's sort of where I asked Josh if he wouldn't mind if I got to share that.
Yeah, because she actually cut that point to save time. Whereas if TJ, our lead pastor, TJ, was presenting this message, he just would have left it in there, and we would have went over about 15 minutes.
We would have been scrambling trying to figure out what we're going to do. So I decided to cut a point probably about midway through last week that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense without the other 2 points. And so I still wanted the opportunity to share this point, because I think it's really important for us and what this story teaches us. But the Samaritan woman at the well and the conversation that she had with Jesus can also teach us that we need to drop our jars. Now, that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense without some context. So at the end of the message that I did this past week, in John chapter 4, in the last little part, Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, and he's just told her, hey, look, I am the Messiah, and he had just shared that he knew all this information about her that she hadn't shared with anybody. And she put her jar down, and then she ran back into Sychar, and she ran back and told everybody what had just happened. And so she put her jar down and she ran, because she no longer needed the water that she was going to put into that jar. She was going to use the living water that only Jesus could provide, and that she was going to become a well herself and sharing this living water with other people. So she kind of got into this whole probably overwhelming situation where she was like, I'm going to put my jar down and I'm going to run like crazy into town and tell people what happened. And I think for us in our situations, once Jesus comes into our broken and ugly and messy places and redeems what we are experiencing, we need to do kind of the same thing. Like, we need to drop our jars and run like crazy and tell other people what Jesus has done for us. And I know that that's sometimes scary and that's sometimes hard, but we need to be willing to share our testimonies and share what Jesus has done for us in order for us to really, that's sort of what Jesus has called us to do.
Yeah, and it's almost like when you read stories like that throughout the New Testament, as people have these encounters with Jesus, right? It's almost like not something that they even think about. It's just the natural response to the situation once they realize who Jesus is, right? Like, same with the blind man who is healed, and the first thing he does is run and tell everybody that he was blind, but now he sees. Right. It's almost like if this sort of real encounter and transformation is happening in your life when you encounter Jesus, this should almost feel like a natural response to that. Like, you've got to go and tell other people what you've just discovered.
Right. And so and for the Samaritan woman, right, one of the reasons why she went to the well in the middle of the day was she was purposely avoiding people, and she didn't want people to know the embarrassing things in her life. And she almost does this complete 180, right? She runs back and she says in verse 39 of chapter 4, she says, he told me everything I did. She's telling people, like, here is all my dirty laundry. Let me air it out for everybody and show you exactly. He knew everything. And for her, it didn't matter anymore. She wanted to share that Jesus had redeemed her. The other thing that I think we have to kind of consider, for her, it was important for her to drop that jar and leave it behind so she could run fast. And so if we're thinking about our lives and what our jar that we're holding on to, it's most of the time it's a distraction that's keeping us from sharing our testimony. So it could be something like goal setting, like you're very focused on your career and your family, or maybe it's just keeping a clean house where you're like, I can't go do this because I need to make sure I get the chores done at my home. Or maybe it's just a whole lot of different excuses that you've put in your jar that have kept you from sharing your testimony. And one of the excuses I think that we often hear is we just don't know how to share our stories. Like it can be something. Josh and I, we listen to a lot of testimonies. And a lot of times people are like very concerned about sharing their story and what that looks like. Because obviously there are some concerns behind it, and I don't know if you want to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. Or a lot of times people think, maybe they feel like their story isn't significant enough, or that their story's not worth telling, or something like that. But I think it's important to remember why you're telling the story, right? It's not about your story. It's necessarily, it's not about you anyway, but it's about the encounter that you've had with Jesus and the change, the life change that can bring. And of course, that looks different for everybody, right? Sometimes it's really dramatic in people's lives. Sometimes it's not, right? Not as dramatic, right? Sometimes it's maybe it's something you grew up with, and so it's very familiar to you. And so the shock maybe is not there, or the surprise, like the blind man coming to see, isn't there. But that, like I said, the communicating Jesus to other people isn't about you. So it's not about the surprise and the shock that you feel, but it's about the power, right? The power of an encounter with Jesus. And everybody can talk about that in their life if they've had that encounter with Jesus. So
yeah, I think people worry about like the details and the specifics and like making sure that they don't want to, it's not important. Those things are not necessarily important. It's the power behind your story. And, and another thing that I love is that we may think that our testimonies are like the most important thing, but they're not. Actually, our testimonies shouldn't be the foundation of somebody's faith. They should be a starting off point for people. It should be what sparks curiosity and wondering for other people. There's a passage in Luke 24 where there's a couple women that return to Jesus's tomb to see that he's no longer there, and they're sad, they're grieving, and they're upset, and the angels appear, and he's like, hey, like, why are you upset? They're like, well, Jesus is not here. And the angel said, oh, don't you remember what Jesus said? He told you that this was going to happen. And so the women in that moment remember, and they're excited, and they run to town, and they share that the prophecy was fulfilled that Jesus had told them. And they go and tell the disciples, and the disciples say, well, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. And that's probably a lot of times what you may hear from people when you share your testimony, that's nonsense. But out of that group of disciples, Peter looked at the women and was he was curious. And so he returned to the tomb himself to see exactly what was there. And so even if it's just one person in the process that you spark curiosity and wonder, that helps them begin to dig deeper in who Jesus is and why he made such an impact on your life. And I think as believers, we have to remember that Jesus, he has basically commissioned us to do this. This isn't something we opt out of. This isn't something we say we're not good at. Like Jesus tells us in Matthew 28:18, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. He doesn't say go if you feel comfortable talking to other people. He doesn't say go only if your friends are going with you. No, Jesus says go and make disciples. He does not give us any out. And so we have to remember that even if this distraction that's in front of us is keeping us from it, we're still responsible and we're held accountable to Jesus to do this. He's told us that this is what we need to do.
Yeah, I think an issue that I think a lot of us might struggle with when we're thinking about sharing our faith with other people, sharing our story, having a conversation with somebody about who Jesus is and the things that he can do for you in your life and the things that he has done. I think sometimes we get this like all or nothing mentality where it's like, if I tell this person my story, or if I share my faith with this person, and if I try to persuade somebody of the things that I have experienced for myself, and I can't see, or the end result is not them accepting or believing me or believing in Jesus, or even acknowledging in a way that I want them to the things that I've just told them, then we just think to ourselves that it's not worth doing.
That was a waste of time.
Like this was not beneficial for this person, and a good way to think about it is I read this book, and I've promoted this book on the podcast before, a book called Tactics by Greg Koukl. And the way that he puts it, because the whole book is about how to have sort of spiritual conversations with people as part of your normal everyday life, right? How do we do what Kelly has just said that we need to do, what we should be doing, and sharing Jesus with other people in a way that is like a part of who we are all the time? And he puts it as, you shouldn't be looking for the harvest. You should be trying to be a really good gardener, right? And what he means by that is nobody plants a garden and expects the crop to be ready for harvest immediately, right? It takes a lot of time. Sometimes it takes multiple different gardeners coming in and doing different things before you're going to be a harvest. And some people are only gardeners, and some people are harvest reapers, right?
Oh, that's really good.
And so a good way to think about sharing your faith with people and think about your interactions with other people, and when you're doing that, is that just try to be the best gardener that you can be. Just plant seeds. Another way he puts it is put a stone in somebody's shoe. Make it your goal just to leave people thinking, right? Even if that thought doesn't translate to anything you'll ever see, maybe you'll never see it.
Well, and I think as a society, I think we are so used to the immediate gratification, right? And so this is so
that's built
hard.
into our personality types.
Yeah, no, I think
that's our culture.
That's a really, really good illustration, because I think that's true. There's probably some of us who are better gardeners, but that doesn't get us out of not planting the seeds. Like, we've got to still plant the seeds, even if we don't get to see the fruit that comes from it.
Yeah,
I think we need to push
break
that.
that all or nothing mentality and go into conversations not looking for a result, right? But just looking to get somebody thinking. And I always say this, we talk about this in the office all the time, because we're always having conversations with people, whether it's criticism or tough conversations or whatever. We're all of us on staff are either having that with each other, or we're having that with people in our congregation. We're having that in our families. Most people are usually having tough conversations at some point. And we always try to remind each other that even if the response was negative, or it seemed like what we had to say wasn't being heard, there's still going to be people are still going to be thinking about what you said, right? Nobody walks away from any conversation and just completely forgets everything that was said, even if they act like they did. Right? You don't actually do that. So, always remember that when you have these kinds of conversations, you may never see a response. But that doesn't mean that God's not working in their life.
Yeah, that He didn't use it
and
for sure.
using the things that you've shared.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to encourage you, think about yourself as the Samaritan woman and think, okay, what is the thing that I'm holding on to that's preventing me from running and sharing my story, preventing me from going as fast as I can? And I'm holding on to this because I'm worried about, breaking it or losing it or whatever. Like, are you obsessing with your looks? Like, are you spending too much time focusing on yourself? Or maybe it's social media. Like you're constantly going there to get affirmed and to receive that affirmations that you could be receiving from God. Or are you finding your accomplishments in your kids? Are you finding your meaning in your kids' accomplishments? Are you spending too much time holding on to what your kids are accomplishing and you're not looking around and talking to other people about what God's done in your life? So what I want to encourage you to do is to put whatever distractions down, whatever excuse that you may be holding on to, and really just pray that God opens your heart and your mind to seeing the things that maybe you've never seen before, the opportunities that you could go and plant a seed, and realizing and just letting God help you understand that even though your story doesn't feel like a lot, it can make the difference in someone else's life. And so I just want to encourage you to drop the distractions, to drop the excuses. Pray that God opens your heart and opens your mind to being used in whatever way that He has for you.
Yeah, and be active about it too. Another big reason that I've seen in my own life and people that I'm close with, a reason why we may not step out and share our experience with Jesus or communicate that with somebody is just because of straight up fear, right? And maybe it's from a real experience we've had in the past where we shared our story with somebody and they were resistant or not even resistant, maybe hostile towards it, pushed back. And so there's this fear now associated with us sharing our story, and you can be active in rectifying that, right? And honestly, this is something Jesus told us to expect, right? He told us to expect pushback.
Yep.
Because as freeing and as merciful as the gospel message is, it is also offensive because it takes this acknowledgement, it takes this recognition that we have failed,
right,
and that maybe we are failing, and we need to bring that all to God and ask Him to forgive us of that. And a lot of people want to hang on to those things, and so they're very resistant to it. So something that you can do to sort of overcome the fear of maybe getting pushback, because you're going to get pushback, is just prepare yourself for it. Maybe think about some of the questions or some of the intellectual fronts that people are going to put up as a barrier to trying to affirm any of the things that you're affirming based off of your encounter with Jesus, and be ready to face those head on. And when you take some time to do that, whether it's just by thinking about them or what, like me and Colton talked about in the podcast last week, taking a class in the upcoming growth track that's coming up this fall, where we can talk and think about these things. Prepare yourself for the pushback so that when you encounter it, not only are you more willing to not back down, but you'll actually have legitimate responses and help brush away those excuses, so people now can still think about the grace, mercy, and the experience that you've had with Jesus yourself. So take active steps, preventative measures, by thinking about the difficult questions.
Yeah, just be better
about
prepared.
The truth of Christianity. So you can be ready to face that, and it's not going to be an obstacle for you in sharing your testimony with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime you can enter any situation more prepared, you're going to feel better and more confident about what you're sharing.
Yep. And then you may never even get that pushback in certain instances, but because you did the work, maybe you were more willing to share in one instance than you would have been without doing that work.
Right.
And so now you're sharing and maybe not even getting that pushback or resistance. But take some active steps to do that.
Yeah. So, hey, thanks for letting me share my extra
Yeah.
Extra point.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to catch the message that Kelly spoke this past Sunday, you can find that on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page, as well as previous episodes of the podcast. You can find those there or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of your favorite streaming platforms. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.